The following is my speech given at the UN Security Council in New York. I was supposed to be there in person, although my flight was cancelled without any replacement flights to get me there on time. Nonetheless, here is my speech, and afterward I will give some comments to further extend upon my argument.
And now I would like to give the floor to our first briefer. You will hear from Professor Diesen, a political analyst, expert on European security and Russian foreign policy, who has published extensively on geopolitics. Today, he will discuss how the conflict in Ukraine unfolds not only on the front line, but also in the information space, examining how media narratives shape public perception and influence the risks of escalation. Mr. Diesen, we wanted to welcome you here in New York, but please have the floor.
Thank you. I wish I could have been there in person, but thank you for the invitation, and it's a great privilege to speak here today. I want to address how the conflict in Ukraine takes place, as you said, both on the battlefield and in the information space, and why we should be concerned about the media manipulating narratives as well as demonizing the adversary. Some of the most insightful literature about political propaganda comes from Walter Lippmann, following his work for the US government during the First World War. Lippmann recognized that liberal democracies tended to present conflicts as a struggle between good and evil to mobilize public support for war. The great risk, according to Lippmann, was that once the public believed that the adversary was pure evil, well, then the public and the politicians would also then reject any workable peace. Because in a struggle between good and evil, compromise is appeasement, and peace demands that war is fought, as good must defeat evil. So this is deeply problematic because the point of departure in international security is the recognition of the security competition, as efforts by one country to enhance its security can diminish the security of others. So the first step toward a common peace is therefore to place ourselves in the shoes of our opponent and recognize these mutual security concerns. However, in a struggle between good and evil, even understanding the opponent becomes treasonous. We should therefore be terrified that our political leaders, as well as the media, no longer even discuss the security concerns of adversaries. Those attempting to see the world from the other side are simply denounced as Putinists, panda huggers, or Ayatollah apologists. If the generations before us had this level of maturity, it's highly unlikely we would have survived the Cold War. So it's very evident that the media does not always report on objective reality. Convinced that they're fighting the good fight, the media often socially constructs its own reality, and journalists become information warriors. For example, recognizing the losses of the Ukrainian armed forces threatens to reduce public support for the war. Similarly, recognizing that sanctions do not work threatens to reduce public support for sanctions. So the media often ignores these realities and instead stay loyal to the narratives to ensure that the public remains committed to the conflict. But as Lippmann noted, thereby they also remove all pathways toward a workable peace. We therefore see that Russia must play this dual role in the media, as we've all seen. On one hand, it has to be both hopelessly backwards and weak, yet it's also an overwhelmingly powerful threat to the West. So we're told that Russia is unsuccessful in Ukraine, yet it can also conquer Europe if we don't stop it. This is intended to communicate to the Western public that the adversary is very dangerous, yet also reassure the public that Russia can easily be defeated if we just keep the war going. So the foundational narrative in the media during this conflict has been the so-called unprovoked invasion by Russia. This is an important narrative because it implies that Russia is an expansionist and imperialist power, as opposed to responding to security threats. There is no debates about the narrative of an unprovoked invasion in the media, and any challenge to this narrative is usually smeared and censored for allegedly legitimizing the invasion. And I say that the unprovoked invasion narrative is dangerous because it implies that any compromise is appeasement that rewards the aggressor, which then incentivizes further aggression. Thus, we're told that peace demands supplying weapons to elevate the costs. As with any other conflict after the Cold War, we see that the media describe the opponents as yet another reincarnation of Hitler, to remind the public that war is peace and diplomacy is appeasement. Or as the former NATO Secretary General argued, the weapons are the path to peace. Again, this is a dangerous narrative, because if this conflict was provoked, then we are escalating and getting directly involved in a war against the world's largest nuclear power, which considers itself to be in an existential conflict. And we've seen that since the 1990s, many leading Western politicians, intelligence chiefs, ambassadors, and other diplomats warned exactly about these consequences of expanding NATO. NATO expansion entailed cancelling agreements for pan-European security, and instead redivide the continent, restart the logic of the Cold War, and then fight in the shared neighborhood over where to draw the new dividing lines. Again, none other than George Kennan stated in an interview back in 1998 that NATO expansionism would start a new Cold War, and he predicted, quote, "Of course there's going to be a bad reaction from Russia, and then the NATO expanders will say, 'We always told you that is how the Russians are, but this is just wrong.'" However, we do see that the media cannot recognize the obvious, that NATO expansion provoked this conflict, because this then risks legitimizing Russian military actions. Yet NATO countries crossed the ultimate red line by pulling Ukraine into the NATO orbit and developing it into a frontline state against Russia. Keep in mind, Angela Merkel once recognized that offering Ukraine a membership action plan for NATO would be interpreted by Moscow as, quote, "a declaration of war." The former British ambassador to Russia, Roderick Lyne, said the following about pulling Ukraine into NATO, quote, "It was stupid on every level at that time. If you want to start a war with Russia, that's the best way of doing it." In a note by the CIA Director William Burns, he also argued that attempting to pull Ukraine into NATO would likely trigger a Russian military intervention, which Burns noted was something Russia would not want to do. Now, these all seems like excellent definitions of the word provoked, yet we cannot use this word. And in February of 2014, NATO countries nonetheless backed a coup to pull Ukraine into the NATO orbit. Our media nonetheless sold the coup as a democratic revolution. Even though Yanukovych was elected in a free and fair election, his removal and even the riots on the Maidan did not have a majority support among Ukrainians, and it violated the Ukrainian constitution. And for a brief moment in 2014, the Western media reported that the new authorities in Kyiv were attacking Donbass, killing civilians who rejected the legitimacy of the coup, and CNN even questioned if the people of Donbass would ever again allow Kyiv to rule over them. Yet soon thereafter, full media conformity was implemented, and the resistance in Donbass was portrayed as a mere Russian operation, aiming to oppose Ukraine's democratization. Now, we have now learned that on the first day after the coup, American and British intelligence agencies set up a partnership with the new intelligence chief in Kiev to rebuild Ukrainian intelligence services from scratch as a proxy against Russia. We learned that the Ukrainian general prosecutor argued that the US was running Ukraine as a fiefdom after the coup. We learned that members of parliament were arrested, some were stripped of their citizenship, the media was purged, the Russian language was purged, the Orthodox Church was purged, and civilians in Donbass were killed for year after year. Nationalists and Western-financed NGOs undermined the Minsk II peace agreement and set clear red lines for Zelensky not to implement the peace mandate, which he had won in 2019. And we saw that a top advisor to the former president of France argued that the signing of the US-Ukraine Charter on Strategic Partnership in November 2021, quote, convinced Russia that it must attack or be attacked. I think it's safe to say that had Russia or China done any of these things, say in Mexico, we would have surely have defined it as provocative. Yet we can't do this in our media. So to sell the story of a Russian war of conquest, the media from day one promoted the notion of a full-scale invasion, suggesting that Russia used its full military might to conquer Ukraine, as opposed to forcing Ukraine to restore its neutrality. And for this reason, we see that the media, they can't inform the public that the low Russian troop levels and initial actions were completely inconsistent with conquest. Rather, it indicated the intention of keeping Ukraine out of NATO. The media can't inform the public that on the first day of the invasion, Zelensky confirmed that they had been contacted by Moscow to discuss peace negotiations based on Ukraine not joining NATO, which Zelensky agreed to. The media can't inform the public about how Zelensky himself said in March of 2022, quote, "There are those in the West who don't mind a long war because this would mean exhausting Russia, even if this means the demise of Ukraine and comes at the cost of Ukrainian lives." So the media can also not inform the public about the sabotage of the Istanbul peace negotiations, after which the Turkish foreign minister concluded, quote, "I had the impression that there are those within NATO member states that want the war to continue. Let the war continue and Russia gets weaker. They don't care much about the situation in Ukraine." So instead of having the media discuss a European security architecture that could mitigate the security competition and prevent Ukraine from being a battlefield in a redivided Europe, the media instead has demonized Russia as pure evil, sold the story that even diplomacy should be rejected, even as hundreds of thousands of men died in the trenches. The media pushed the narrative of Ukraine winning, of Russian efforts to restore the Soviet Union, downplaying the losses of the Ukrainian army, and ignoring the de-Russification policies and the brutal conscription of Ukrainian men. All of this was done under the banner of standing with Ukraine, irrespective of what Ukrainians actually wanted. Even as Ukraine now faces disaster and we could end up in a direct war with Russia, there is no willingness to recognize that Russia has any legitimate security concerns. Instead, everything happens in a vacuum. And the media remains committed to the narrative of an evil Russian enemy, and the logical conclusion is therefore further escalation rather than exploring paths towards a workable peace. So, if we want to understand why it's become impossible to even discuss peace, why diplomacy has been criminalized, I advise that we look towards the very dangerous media coverage and remember the warnings of Walter Lippmann about simplifying complex conflicts into a simple struggle between good and evil. So, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Glenn, for your statement, but not only for participation in making this speech, but also for your scientific work and public work. And I would suggest to colleagues to look into your books and articles and also the podcast that you have.
Let me add some further comments, which there was no time to make during my speech. So resolving conflicts and wars can be extremely difficult as human nature and the condition of conflict resolution often clash, because human beings are a group animal. We largely organized by groups for meaning and security, and it's also therefore in human nature to divide ourselves into the in-group us versus the out-group them, the other. So, when human beings experience an external threat, it's in human nature to seek solidarity within the group for security and to survive. And we create, therefore, clear divisions between the in-group and the out-group by contrasting our virtue with our opponent's evil nature. When the white gets whiter, the black gets blacker, we see that the gray area disappears. And this is what prevents the individual from diverging too much from the group. And essentially, people conform to their own in-group and do not even discuss the concerns and interests of the out-group, as this could be seen as having sympathies for the adversary. Now, this is an instinct in human nature which can be exploited further by political propaganda. And indeed, political propaganda is largely organized around developing the stereotypes for the in-group versus the out-group. And all the complexities of a conflict is simplified into a mere struggle between the good guys and the bad guys. So this is human nature. The problem is this framing prevents conflict resolution. because, as I said in my speech, the point of departure in international security is to reduce the security competition. And to do so, we have to recognize the security concerns of the opponent, especially when you're fighting a nuclear power that considers itself to be facing an existential threat and fighting a war for survival. Now, a key case study has been the First World War, when the US government presented Germany as pure evil in order to mobilize a reluctant public for war. Now, this then was sold to the public as the war against the ultimate evil, a dehumanized German adversary. This was the war that would, quote, be the war to end all wars. It was the war to make the world safe for democracies. Essentially, with such a framing, only total victory can create peace. And here is why people like Walter Lippmann went from being, to a large extent, supporters of the use of propaganda to becoming critics. Because it resulted in ignoring possible diplomatic solutions to end the war, workable peace, as Lippmann framed it. And even after Germany had been defeated, we saw that this prevented a lasting peace, because when you fight pure evil, you can't restore a balance of power, such as was done with bringing France, giving it a seat around the table after the Napoleonic War. Instead, we saw that the Germans had to be properly defeated. It was given a humiliating defeat after the First World War, and it was also a defeat which was intended to keep Germany permanently weak. And as we later learned, this set the conditions for another world war. So while it might seem very patriotic to present the adversary as pure evil in order to signal loyalty to the in-group, it definitely goes against our own interest to the extent it undermines the ability to create a permanent peace. Now, let me quote some of the work of Raymond Aron, who famously warned in the 1962 about dividing states into good and evil. He wrote, quote, "Idealistic diplomacy slips often into fanaticism. It divides states into good and evil, into peace-loving and bellicose. It envisions a permanent peace by the punishment of the latter and the triumph of the former. The idealist, believing he has broken with power politics, exaggerates its crime." Now, this has also been my main concern after the Cold War, when the West established itself as a collective hegemon and insisted it was a force for good. All conflicts were then framed as being liberal democracies versus authoritarians, which is a nice placeholder for good guys versus bad guys. Indeed, after I gave my speech there at the UN Security Council, some critical comments predictably came from the European delegations. And to summarize, this was essentially me making excuses for Russia. The West is not the problem, and the decision of going to war was solely made by Russia. In other words, the entire assessment is, what are you saying? Which narratives are you pushing? The only way they are assessed is, are you legitimizing us or them? But my point is, this is not about taking one side or the other. It's about the inability to even discuss security concerns of our opponents. And this is necessary. To take the security concerns of our opponents into account is required to predict their reactions and thus calibrate our foreign policy accordingly in order to maximize our security. Because it's very hard to convince anyone that the policies we have pushed now have enhanced our security or done anything good for Ukraine. There is also this assumption that the West does not actually do propaganda, because the West consists of liberal democracies, and propaganda is what authoritarian states do. Now, this is an amazing demonstration of propaganda itself, because propaganda used to be considered normal statecraft. People would refer to themselves as propagandists, and it only became a dirty word as the Germans used it in the 1930s. Edward Bernays, which is considered to be the main author of the initial literature on political propaganda, therefore contributed to essentially rebrand it as public relations. Because what our adversaries do is propaganda, what we do is public relations. And this is to a large extent what propaganda also does. It changes the language to convince the public as opposed to using rational arguments. So we create one set of language for what we do versus another for what our adversaries are doing. Again, it helps to boost the legitimacy of the in-group and delegitimize the out-group, which is good for internal solidarity, but terrible for resolving conflicts if we can't even compare our policies with our opponents. Now, it can also be said that there was a near complete consensus among the original scholars on political propaganda a century ago that liberal democracies were actually more reliant on propaganda. Because when sovereignty is transferred to the people, it would then become more necessary to manage the masses. From Edward Bernays, Walter Lippmann, this was not a controversial statement. Indeed, there was a clear correlation between expanding the voting rights and the need to simplify political discourse to present conflicts as the complexity of politics as a simple struggle between good and evil. We saw this correlation as it became more challenging to manage the masses. And even during the Cold War, it was also recognized by many scholars that the US and the UK had more efficient propaganda because a key component of propaganda is source credibility. And while the Soviets only relied on state apparatus and everyone could see who was delivering the messages, for the British and the Americans, they could then whitewash or siphon their propaganda through non-governmental institutions, private industries, and indeed, this is how propaganda is also done today. We use non-governmental organizations and other institutions to make it sound more credible. And last, let me just say that it's extremely frustrating for an academic like myself, who has for more than 20 years warned against this war we're now seeing in Ukraine, which I've been warning would destroy Ukraine and possibly instigate a direct war between NATO and Russia, which could then develop into a nuclear exchange. In such a scenario, we would all lose. Yet, every time I've warned about this over the past 20 years, it's essentially met the wall. It's interpreted solely as then taking the side of Russia, because by recognizing the Russian security concerns and how they will respond, it's then simply dismissed as taking the side of the out-group, and thus even seen as a betrayal of the in-group. So this is what I've seen over the past years, indeed. The warnings about NATO expansion cancelling the pan-European security architecture was dismissed as being pro-Russian, warning that the Orange support for the Orange Revolution in 2004 would result in only conflicts with Russia and war, also denounced as pro-Russian. In 2008, when NATO promised to expand NATO to Ukraine and Georgia, even though there was only a small minority of Ukrainians who wanted to join NATO, and knowing that this would likely trigger a war and even possibly breaking Russia, that's why breaking Europe, it was also seen as pro-Russian. In 2014, when NATO countries backed the coup to remake Ukraine into a front line against Russia, the disaster was already evident. And but this was also seen as pro-Russian, something that could legitimize the opponent. During the 7 years of sabotaging the Minsk agreement, this was also pro-Russian, because if anything, if you support us, that is your own country, then you should always blame Russia, even though the consequence would be war. In 2019, we criticized the sabotage of Zelensky's peace mandate by NATO countries. This was also pro-Russian. In 2021, when the warnings became more and more evident that the war would happen. This was then, I even wrote an article, by the way, in November of 2021 with the title something along the line that war will soon be unavoidable. This was simply denounced as legitimizing the military actions by Russia. So again, there can be no recognition of the opponent because this is then considered to be support. In 2022, it criticized several Western countries sabotaging the Istanbul negotiations. This was also seen as pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian, even though it then predictably resulted in the destruction of Ukraine, which also Zelensky had warned about. And over the past 4 years, I've seen lie after lie intended to create the conditions for a long war, as hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians were sacrificed in a war that could not be won under the banner of standing with Ukraine. And I've listened to leaders arguing that the weapons are the path to peace while they criminalized diplomacy. There's no way this can be explained as being in our interest or being even in the Ukrainians' interests. But nonetheless, it all operates under the banner of being pro-us. And if you dissent, then you're pro-Russian. And what was this all for? Very predictably, Ukraine is being destroyed with horrible humanitarian consequences. And in the wider strategic framing, we see that relations with Russia is destroyed for decades and decades to come at this critical point in time when the world is shifting into multipolarity, and we would definitely have been in our interest to keep Russia on our side of the ledger. We see Europe now being in systemic decline with economic problems which can't be fixed without ending the division of Europe, security problems, and of course, political fragmentation, which we will see in the months to come. Now, we also see that the international system is falling apart, international law itself disintegrating, and the future of the UN no longer being clear. So time and time again, there has been many pathways towards a workable peace, yet every time this is rejected, as Putin is presented as Hitler and Russia is an evil adversary which we can't even make peace with. And it always goes back to the same original problem, the inability to even discuss the security concerns of their opponent. And this, as I mentioned in my speech, also applies to China, Iran, or whatever country we now see as being the bad guy. So thank you for your attention.